Hello, welcome everyone to Sport Tech Day's episode with Jamieson, Doyle-Taylor, who is a lawyer or has been a lawyer for over 10 years, turned sports agent. So quite an interesting story. Jamieson, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Cool.
No, awesome. Look, as always, we like to start off with who we're speaking to and go into our guest's background. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So about me, as you've alluded to in the introduction, I've spent the last 10 or so years working in private practice law. So I've worked for a number of major law firms, both in Australia and internationally. And that's been a good period of time and the large part of my professional career.
Yeah.
But more recently, and perhaps more relevant to this discussion today, is the transition that I'm still in at the moment, the transition phase from that private practice lawyer into the sports agency space. And what I've done is I've set about on a journey with G2G Sports, which is a sports consulting agency that I've established about 18 months ago, based here on the Gold Coast where I'm living at the moment. And it's a sports consulting agency which is dealing with issues relating to player management predominantly, and it's been set up to capitalise on my legal experience and my background in law and private practice law over that past 10 years and lots of transactional experience, etc.
Yeah.
And then to combine that with my passion for sport, which has been my passion growing up for my whole life. I've played sport and still am involved to this day at various levels and in different sports across a long period of time. And so it got to a point in time, 18 months ago or so when I set up G2G Sports, where I had to make a decision, I think, with respect to my career as to whether I decide to go on for the long term as a lawyer and seek partnership in big law firms and this sort of thing, or do I want to pivot and do something else? And I had that, look internally with myself, that discussion, and it was a case that I wanted to go and do something that I was passionate about. Law was something that served me quite well over the period of time, but it wasn't something that held any great passion for me. And I said to myself, is this something that I can see myself doing for the next 20, 30 years' time?
Yeah.
A period in my life? And the answer was no. And that led to me then thinking, well, what am I going to do from here? How can I move away from law, but not, throw away all of the skills and experience and everything that came along with that? And that's where I came up with the idea for G2G Sports.
No, awesome. I was just going to say, so on that note, the thought of a lawyer turning into a sports agent, it seems bizarre from an outsider's perspective.
Yep.
I guess what was the final nail in the coffin that sort of made you, led to you making that decision?
So for me to make that decision, it was a case of really tapping into what I'm passionate about. So I can continue going on with my law, and I've got fantastic experience with some of the best law firms in Australia and around the world, and I could continue doing that. I could do that quite well, but it wouldn't be something that I would be doing with passion. And at this stage in my life, it was a situation where I didn't have commitments in terms of relationships or kids or things like this that were locking me into a certain career path or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I saw it as an opportunity to, if I was going to do something, this was the time to do it. If I wait a year, maybe you end up in a relationship, maybe you, have some other thing, some other factor in your career that means that you don't make the decision that I made. So it was a situation at the time where the circumstances were, let's do it now. It's the best chance you're going to get to do it if you're going to do it.
Yep. No, awesome. So you had to make that decision. And then secondly, I guess it's the process of actually becoming a sports agent. What was the process like, and what accreditation did you need to get started?
Yeah, sure. So the process, I guess, for me, my accreditation is with the AFL Players Association. So for the listeners who are listening more internationally, the AFL is the Australian Football League, which is our premier sporting code here in Australia. The AFL Players Association is the governing body, I guess, if you like, that regulates agents and their accreditation process and their conduct and these sort of things following accreditation. But their primary function is there to support the players. So think of them like a players' union, if you like.
Yeah.
And then the AFL, then the AFL player agents, they are responsible or reporting to the PA. So the accreditation process is all done through the Players Association once a year. And what it was for me, and it's similar most years, I understand, but they may or may not change it from year to year slightly. But for me, last year when I went through the process, it was a case of initially doing a online application. It was like an online form that was completed, talking about what your experience is, what your background is, how you'd be a good fit for the industry. What benefit you would be bringing to the industry based on your experience. Why you want to be involved, what connections you have, from your past as maybe a player or a coach or a volunteer or whatever it may be. And then it was a matter of providing some references from your your career and your personal life and this sort of thing, which the Players Association then did background checks and then this sort of thing on before they made a offer available to come and attend a 3-day session. I think it was around this time last year, June, July last year.
Oh,
There
wow.
was a 3-day intensive in Melbourne, and it was terrific education. Whether you obtain the accreditation or not from that process, the intensive was just a real eye-opening experience as to what goes on behind the scenes. I think a lot of people might turn the telly on and watch a game of footy and go, "Oh yeah, that was great," but to see some of the inner workings as to what actually happens, and there were speakers came from all different parts of the broader AFL business. So the Players Association is just one small part of the bigger AFL.
Yeah.
And so we had speakers coming through from the AFL, from Clubland, from current agents who were giving their perspective from it. What your day-to-day is going to be like, and tips and tricks and things to avoid and this sort of thing. There were players in there sharing their experience. There was people talking about integrity issues. There was Indigenous issues covered off on, significant discussions around women's AFL, which has just come to life in the last 4 or 5 years here. Yeah. And I could go on, but this was all within a 3-day intensive period. Yeah. It was just, an incredible amount of information, all very well received. But,
Yeah.
it was, quite, for someone who's so passionate about the game, for me to be involved in that environment. You're meeting some people who are coming in to do the accreditation course from various different perspectives, some similar to me with maybe a legal or other business background, some current and recently retired players who are looking to go into that space to continue their career, and just different people who are coming at it from different angles, and it's just interesting to just talk to those people because everyone sees things differently. Yeah. And you can take something from each of them, and it was a good networking event in that regard because they're going to be your peers and your colleagues, for the foreseeable future. Yeah. Those people, so all worthwhile, and of course getting to know and build relationships with the people from the Players Association, and starting, building those relationships was also a pretty important part of that 3-day intensive.
Right. Awesome. I was just going to say, you go there and obviously, you were successful. So what's the next step after that? Like any startup company, I guess, day one, you're looking at like a blank canvas, basically. How do you get started?
Yeah. So there was an exam, just in case anyone's interested in the actual process. So that 3-day intensive wasn't just turn up and then you do the 3 days and then you get the ticket. It has 3 days and then you set a 3 or 4 hour exam or whatever it was. And then that gets assessed and then the decision's made. It's a reasonably quick turnaround on that, but it's an exam at the end that determines, whether you're accredited or not. And then from there, for me, the business had been started prior to the accreditation because it was a timing thing. So I came out of my previous legal role, started the business, and I could see that the accreditation process was a little bit further down the track, about 6 months or so. And so what I saw that as an opportunity to do was to just get some learning in that period before I got to that point in time where I was going into that 3-day intensive. There was a well-known past player agent who offered some guidance and support during that period, and just being able to pick his brains and get some insights from him. He actually ran like a short course through LinkedIn. So there were other people who probably got involved with that as well. So that was just more preparation type thing for me to do that. And that meant that by the time I got to that intensive, I wasn't just rocking up blind. I was rocking up with a bit of insight into what might be in front of me.
Right. No, awesome. So, well, I guess after you were formally accredited, what were the next steps after that? Like, is it, I think I was saying at some point, like when people think of a sports agent, they think of Jerry Maguire.
Yeah.
So from your point of view, like when you got the accreditation, what were the first couple of things that you had to get started on?
Yeah, so again, it was sort of like, I was confident that I would do what I needed to do and to get the accreditation. So I was planning as if I was going to get it. So I was doing some small things in the background to get myself ready to receive the accreditation. And when that did come through, for me, it was a matter of then starting formally, like making like interactions and connections with, various clubs within the AFL. But more importantly, the G2G sports, just to give you a bit of a idea as to the business.
Yeah.
The G2G stands for grassroots to the G. So grassroots number 2G. For anyone looking at it, it's grassroots to the G in the sense that what we want to do is support athletes all the way through from grassroots level and be out in the community and helping athletes at that grassroots community level. That's where my passion is. And I want to support athletes right from the very, very beginning of their journey all the way through to the end. So I didn't want to just come in and sign Lance Franklin or Dustin Martin or some of the superstars of the competition. And I'm sure they're quite happy with their current agents anyway. But, the point being is that the strategy for us was not to come in and target current players. It was to come in and have a whole journey with athletes from the grassroots right through to the G and supporting them right the way through that journey. Now, if someone came to me today from an AFL club, an established player, and wanted to have a discussion, absolutely, I would have that discussion. But that's not where we were going to be putting a lot of our time at the outset, and even now, majority of the time goes into grassroots, and then these opportunities for us as a business will come once we put that investment into the grassroots community. Yeah. And so that's what I've been doing. And well before the accreditation, I was back at my grassroots club where I played, majority of my junior career, Labrador, here on the Gold Coast. So I was back there just supporting them, the senior club on game days, just with volunteer stuff and supporting their game day. It's something as simple as just being like an interchange steward or an umpire escort or something like this. Because I think what I've come to appreciate is the amount of work that the volunteers and the support people involved in suburban and community football put in is so much more than you probably appreciate when you're a young kid going through and just turning up and playing your game and then going home and getting on with your day. There's a lot that goes into it behind the scenes. And it's a bit of just like giving back in a sense, because, there was people doing that for me when I was a kid, and I probably didn't, took it for granted a little bit. Yeah. But now that I have a bit more awareness, it's a nice thing to go back to that grassroots level and just help out as much as I can.
Right. And what areas, like you mentioned, you're not necessarily trying to sign Buddy Franklin and
I'd sign him up if he wants to give me a call. I'm happy to have a chat.
But I guess in the short term, like what are the areas of sport that you're focusing on with your potential clients?
Yeah, sure. So AFL is the main focus for us and for me, and I'm obviously got the accreditation there. So just for anyone who's interested in the accreditation process, it's different for each code, and each sport has a different regime in terms of how you become accredited. So I might, for example, leverage off my AFL accreditation and then have some interaction with an NRL player somehow, but I wouldn't be able to sign him because I haven't yet gone through the NRL accreditation process. Now, I've got people who I could refer him to, but if it was someone who I was like, yeah, this is someone who I really want to represent, then I'm going to have to go through that NRL accreditation process, which is a different process, but the same sort of idea. Same for other sports. Rupa has it for the rugby union. So if there's a Wallaby that came across your radar who was looking for representation or something like that, you'd be contemplating whether you go down that path. FFA has intermediary accreditations for soccer, and cricket as well has separate accreditation process for their players. So it's a situation where you've just got to decide what your market is and which sports you want to prioritize. There's nothing to say that you can't go out and get accredited in all of these things, but there's a cost involved for one. And so if you're a startup, you probably don't have a cost to be running around doing 5, 6, maybe you do. But there's also a time commitment to all of this sort of stuff. So, it's something that you've got to prepare for, and you've got to, you might have to go interstate, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So that's something that these other accreditations, they may fall into place if it makes business sense to obtain them. But just for now,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned, sorry, we're just talking before we started recording about, the women's version of the AFL. There's the Indigenous communities that you're looking to get involved. So what are some of the key groups that you'd like to start representing?
Yeah, so I think the women's AFL is something that I'm just extremely passionate about, and I'm so bullish about that for the long term. I genuinely believe from my conversations with the AFL and the Players Association that they absolutely want to make that work.
Yeah.
And my experience with AFL is when they want to make something work, they make it work. And so that gives me a real lot of confidence that they're going to do what they can to really support it. I've seen, just since I've been involved in this last 18 months, the trajectory of this women's sport but in particular women's AFL has been incredible.
Yeah.
For example, I'm involved on the Gold Coast with a team as an assistant coach, Coolangatta. And so, if you look at the program that they had, a couple of years ago compared to the program that they've got now, they've got a Nicole Graves has come in there. She's been involved with women's football and various things across her journey, which is a pretty unique story for, the last 20 years or so. Most recently coming through the Carlton program. So she's involved there. There's other people that are now involved from the football community here on the Gold Coast that are really, coming together to support the women's sport and the growth of that. There's people that want to come to it. People are becoming drawn to it and wanting to help it, and they can see. You can see with these girls when you go to training how passionate they are about it, how much it means to them. And to be able to just sit there and do anything to support that and make it turn into something that they may have dreamed about as girls growing up, that's a good thing for me.
No, awesome. And what's the reality of day-to-day life? Like, what's your week and how's your week structured, and what's the reality of sort of your 9 to 5?
Yeah. So the week structure is I try and let it flow as much as I can. I'll have certain things booked in, if I've got calls and things, I'll try and do them in the morning because that's the best time when I've got clear space. The reason for that being is because I've got commitments in terms of training commitments at Coolangatta a couple of nights a week. There's another team, Twig Coast Tigers, so I'm assistant coach there as well in the women's space. They're a lower division down from Coolangatta, but they're sort of linked as clubs and work together in a sense. So I'm down there helping them out, 1 or 2 times a week, depending on, scheduling and whoever else can help. And then I have also a role on the Labrador Women's Committee. So back to my my own grassroots club growing up. So I'm the president of the Women's Committee at Labrador there. So we have meetings from time to time. So they're always in the evening. So for me, the evenings are generally blacked out with like active sporting commitments. So I'll be at clubland. So I'll be, at one of those clubs, whatever it might be. During the day, it'll be more of a networking exercise, or if there's any specific work that I might need to do, there might be some sort of contract negotiation, this sort of stuff that needs to be done. There might be signing of new players. There might be meeting with prospects. There might be approaching prospects. There's things like rules and regulations within the guidelines for the agents, how they are to conduct themselves from a AFL Players Association perspective. And so there's specific ways that you have to go about approaching players if you have a view to potentially then signing them down the track. It's a process. So I could go to a game and see someone and they stand out for me. They look like a really good talent. But at the end of the day, I can't just turn up to them after the game and say, hey, do you want to have a chat? I'd really like to sign you up. There's a process where I have to first approach that player via their club and say, look, I went and watched so-and-so on the weekend. I've been following him for a while. He looks like a good prospect. Could you let him know that I'd like to have a discussion with him? The club will then get back to me and say, yeah, sure, we pass on your details. Then it becomes up to the player whether they want to talk to you or not.
Yeah.
Some do, some don't. It's like you just got to respect whatever their decision is. But that's the sort of stuff that I would be doing during the day. So I might have probably, and I've got people helping me and things like this that'll give me ideas as to people who we should be approaching and talking to and this sort of stuff. But for me, then it's about making sure that the process in which we approach the players that we're interested in having discussions with is done properly. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to get ourselves in a situation where we're not acting in accordance with the agent regulations. And so what I want to do, especially in this initial space, initial stages of the startup, is to make sure that we're doing things properly, because that'll set good habits for the business for the long term. So if I do the things properly, it probably takes a little bit, more time than, you might want to quickly rush and do this and rush and do that. But I just have to just take it a step back and make sure I do things really, properly, so that it sets up for when there's, when I have, maybe 4 or 5 agents working with me, and I want them to rely on the systems and processes that I establish at this startup point. And if I do that properly now, it'll set the framework a lot better, I believe, than if I just haphazardly do things, against the regulations or whatever else. So I think it's quite important to do that all properly in the beginning. Also quite important to be building out networks with various clubs. So there's certain leagues that we would focus on. For me here, the NEFL, unlikely to go ahead perhaps this year, QAFL as well, but also South Australia is a pretty key focus area for us. And you touched on Indigenous pathways and things like that earlier, and that's something that we're really, really looking at in South Australia. So building out relationships with all of those SANFL teams. So SANFL is the South Australian National Football League. It's probably the second strongest league in the competition, in the country. But some incredible talent in South Australia. And it just takes time to build out those relationships with each of those clubs, reaching out to each of the coaches or football managers or whoever it might be, just to, introduce yourself or request to speak to one of the players or whatever it is. And then also just looking at footage, watching games of players, highlights. So obviously the majority of players at AFL level are coming out of what's called the NAB League. So NAB's a major sponsor of the AFL, and they support this under 18s pathway, which is where the bulk goes into. And so obviously me being based on the Gold Coast makes it hard for me to attend many of those games. So I'd fly down, with the virus, not in play, I'd fly down to Melbourne every so often and watch those games. But when they're not on, and they still are yet to confirm when they're coming back. But the thing is, I can watch the highlights of those games and I can form a view as to which players we might be interested in having discussions with and that sort of stuff. And then that's another group of teams that you'd want to be building relationships with all of the academies. So all the teams at the AFL level, or majority, have some sort of academy, like the Gold Coast Suns Academy, for example, here, linking in with them and trying to find out, because it's all well and good for me or any of my colleagues who are watching talent and trying to identify talent to say this play looks good, that play looks good, etc. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what I think. What's important is what the recruiting people and the list managers of the AFL clubs think. So it's important to get their insights. If they're consistent with what we're seeing, then great, let's go for it. But if I come and have a coffee with these guys or whatever, and they say, oh, we're looking at this guy, and none of those guys are on your radar, well then maybe it's not as worth your while spending too much time on the guy that you thought might have been. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah. And I think we were talking about the process of becoming an agent. Just going back to that, like, obviously, you went from a professional career to then transitioning into becoming a sports agent. But, if I'm a university student, or even if I'm a high school student and I want to plan out my next 5 or 10 years, and I love my sport and I think it'd be something interesting to do, can you do that straight out of university? And are there any sort of formal education pathways to get into becoming a sports agent?
Yeah. From memory, there was no they ask what your education background is, but it wasn't like you must have this or you must have that or you must have this. They use some discretion as to what your background is. So for me, I've got a law and a business background in terms of my education. So that sort of sits well with player agency in the sense that you're doing a lot of contract negotiation and this sort of stuff. So there's a lot of like crossover from the legal side of things. So that works quite well. So I think, that would have worked in my favor in the process, but it's not as if you don't have a legal background that they would just discard it. There's other avenues. And if you're talking about from a university perspective, I'd recommend that a sports management degree. There's bachelor degrees in sports management, master's degrees in sports management that would open up networks and knowledge and generate knowledge that would be very helpful in this industry. I mean, business is important, finance is important, because at the end of the day, you're going to be talking about contracts and salaries and negotiating those sort of things. So it is important to have an understanding of. And that's another thing that I didn't talk about earlier, was that we talked about like the total pay per player payments and this sort of stuff at the intensive. So understanding, each of the clubs have salary caps and this sort of stuff. So you've got to work. You might want to go in and just be, I've got this player, he wants this much. I'm going to just go in and just be a bulldog and just go after everything. But you've got to think about how it all fits in with the wider and all the broader salary cap, because what you don't want to do is push too hard for your client. And then that gets them on the outer with their club because there's nothing left in the salary cap and people have to get shifted out and this sort of stuff. So it's a balancing act. At the same time, you don't want to sell your client short either. So you've just got to try and be massaging it gently in your negotiations. You don't want to push too hard, but you don't want to be taken advantage of either.
Yeah. No, I get that. And are there any formal, I guess, organizations or resources, like even something simple as a podcast or a YouTube channel or like a website that has a lot of information for, I guess, people that either want to be a sports agent or sort of resources if you want to go down that path for your career within Australia?
Yeah, there is. Just let me think about it. I just, it's on my mind, but not on my tongue, if that makes sense.
Put the link. We can put the link in when we post it on our site. You can just let me know later. No worries.
Yeah, let me circle back, because there's heaps of useful information out there and podcasts and things like that. Just about to find the right one to just suggest for this forum.
We'll put a couple of the best links on the site when we put it up.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for your time, Jamieson. I think we've gone through everything. I think it's a really unique topic that I don't believe we've discussed, at least on our side or our podcast.
Yeah.
Definitely unique view for us. Hope you sort of enjoyed your time as well, and we'll put links into the business site, your LinkedIn profile, and a couple of these resources.
Yeah. No, that's been really good, and hopefully people found it useful. You can share my contact details if people want to reach out. I'm happy to chat to people. I've had people reach out to me, like younger people who are interested in getting into the industry, and that's what I would recommend to people. It's not the sort of thing that's all that easy to get into, but you need to think of a unique way to approach it. So it's not going to be like applying for a law firm where there's 1,000 law firms and you just got to send out your CV and eventually someone would hire you. There's not that many player agents around the place, so you have to try and think of a way, if you're trying to come into the market, that you're going to add value for someone, and try and I'd encourage people to approach directly, but approach directly with some sort of value add, not just approach, can you give me a job?
Yep. Awesome. All right, cool. Thank you so much for coming on, Jamieson.
It's a pleasure, Nicole.
Cool.
Talk to you soon.
Chat soon.
See you, mate. Bye. Bye-bye.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to check out more of our content, go to sporttechdaily.com or follow us on social media across Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram.